wanted to divorce him so I could split the finances, but then he pulled out a signed document. I know I shouldn't have let down my guard the way I did, but what could I have done? I thought he was my husband and he loved me. That's what I thought least. I didn't know that he was also making plans to disgrace me. My name is Debbie. I work for a fashion company and I am 30 years old. I love what I do, and that is because I come to work every day happy, because what I do brings me absolute joy. I also come to work every day seeing my all-time boyfriend. We practically work together. He is the owner of the place I work. The name of my husband is Paul. Paul is a big businessman. I met Paul through our company. He came to our company at that time to do business with us, and from there we began to see each other. Paul is a 34 years old man, and we have been married for 5 years now. The marriage between me and Paul has been a lot of fun for me because I was doing everything I wanted. I could afford anything I wanted. When Paul and I met, I was already in a relationship with my boss then, but Paul was trying to take over Israel's company, and so Israel had told me that I should try and become friends with him so that we would be able to collect his company back. I was able to use my charm to charm him. Paul and I started dating, and by then he had already taken over Israel's company. We went out for a while and Paul introduced me to his family. I knew right away that they didn't like me because of their behavior towards me. I also didn't like him. He was not the type of guy that I like. He was always very suspicious of one thing or the other. 3 months into our relationship, Paul had taken me to various countries and I was loving it. I knew that I didn't like the man, but I liked his money. Paul bought me various gifts and I appreciated it, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the bigger goal, which was for me and Israel to take back his company and even get more of his properties. At some point in our relationship, Paul had told me I should stop working for Israel. He didn't like the way he saw Israel looking at me, but I assured him that it was nothing of such, and that it was not real, and that we were just friends who worked together. I went on a couple dates with Paul and I discovered that he was very busy. He could get calls whenever we were together and he could leave me saying it was an important call and he needed to attend to it. I didn't mind at first, but as time went on, it became a habit. I had told him I didn't like the way he was behaving whenever we were out on lunch, but he told me that he was going to change. Paul introduced me to his friends. They were about his age and they were all married. I thought to myself what I was really doing with this man, but I needed to focus. I met his friends and their wives, who were very rude, by the way. I didn't like the way they spoke to me. It always looked like I was the black sheep among them, and Paul had always insisted that I try and make an effort towards them because he had believed that they were nice and friendly people, but rather they were the opposite. So due to a lot of persuasion from Paul, and Israel advising me that I needed to play along, I decided to go on a spa date with the ladies. I didn't want to go because of how they had made it clear to me on the first day that they didn't like me. I went on the date with them, and as usual, they were all complaining about one thing or the other. They were all saying my clothes were either too short or too exposed. Some of them were saying I wasn't good enough for Paul. Honestly, I didn't give any ear to what they were saying. I enjoyed my spa and I was trying to leave when one of the ladies walked up to me. I didn't know her because the ladies never introduced themselves to me because they were only interested in judging me, but I knew her, and she was the quiet one among them. She had introduced herself as Melinda. Melinda was a petite woman. She had tried to apologize to the ladies, and I told her to forget about it, and that I really didn't care about their opinion about me. Melinda and I exchanged numbers, and she told me she would love to meet up with me sometimes in the week, and I accepted because she looked like a kind person. I came back from the spa date with the ladies, and I decided to invite my boyfriend Israel over to the house because I missed him. I don't normally go to work some days because he knew I was on a mission for us, and he had understood the situation. Israel came over after work and we talked and just about Paul. We also discussed our next plan. Paul was a fun-loving person. He always made me laugh. He was the one that brought me out of nothing. And so when he needed me to do this for him, I didn't think twice because he had always had my back. I made food for Israel and we watched some movies before we slept off. I always felt at peace in his arms. We had indeed come a long way. The next day I was woken up by Paul's call telling me I had to come over to his house and that he wanted to show me something. I didn't want to go because I was in my boyfriend's arms, but he had advised me to go. I went to Paul's house and he had said that he had a surprise for me and I should go up to his room and see it. I started smiling because I liked it whenever Paul gave me gifts. I went up to the room and I saw a designer dress on the bed. I saw a note that told me that I should quickly change into and get ready. I got ready and went downstairs. I appreciated Paul for the dress, and he had told me that there was an event he wanted me to attend with him. I had told him it was too early for an event, but he told me it was for business. I went with him and we got to the event center and Paul had proposed to me. I didn't know what to say or how to respond. I had told him I was going to think about it, and he looked disappointed. We had lunch, but I could see that he wasn't happy. But deep in my mind, I knew that I didn't want to marry him. I didn't love him. I loved someone else. Paul gave me the ring, and he told me that he was giving me a few days to think about it. I went back home and I called Israel. Israel was happy when I broke the news to him. I thought he was going to be angry, but he said that it was a good opportunity for us to get access to his wealth, and also for us to be able to take back Israel's company. I didn't like the idea of getting married to Paul. I didn't like him, and so I didn't see any reason why I should be married to him. But Israel had said that I should just endure for some time, that it was going to be over before I knew it. Israel told me that I should get married to him, and a few months into the marriage I should make sure he transferred the properties to me and I could divorce him. I believed him, and we decided to follow our new plan. A few days later, I called Paul to say that I had accepted his proposal and I wanted to marry him. He was very happy, and he told me I should start preparing for the wedding, and I told him I didn't want a big wedding. I wanted a small one between friends and family, but he had told me he wanted to give me everything, and also his family was a very traditional family, and so they wanted a wedding. The wedding happened and it was very big. His family weren't happy about the fact that he was marrying me because they didn't like it. His friends' wives had no choice but to plaster smiles on their faces that day. I didn't see Melinda that day, and I didn't know why. Maybe she didn't like me like I thought. I wasn't happy that day because Israel wasn't present. I was very sad, but I needed to do this for him. That night after the wedding reception, I sneaked out because I saw Paul talking with his business partners, so I knew it was going to be a while before he noticed that I wasn't around. I took some drinks from the party and went somewhere to drink away my problems. I got to a quiet place and just sat there and drank. After a few hours, I got a call from Paul and I had to disturb my peace. At that time, I was already drunk. I went and I met up with Paul. He told me he had been looking for me and he needed me to sign some marriage papers. I didn't ask what the papers were for and I signed them. I was so drunk that I didn't read it. Looking back now, I wish I had read it. I didn't know that Paul had made me sign up for a prenup saying that I was not going to get anything from the marriage if we divorced. I woke up the next morning and I was having a terrible headache and no recollection of what had happened the day before. After the wedding, we went on a honeymoon, but I had to cut it short because I was not interested. We returned back and Paul got back to work. I had a lot to do because I had to move my things from my house to Paul's house. I liked his house. Actually, it was very big and spacious. I finally moved in when I received a call from Melinda telling me she wanted to meet up with me. I met up with her and she told me that she was very sorry for missing my wedding, that she had problems of her own and she didn't want to be seen in public there. She had told me that her husband was abusive to her, and I advised her to leave him, but she had told me it hasn't gotten to that yet. I didn't want to push her and we continued to chat. She had told me how lucky I was to have married Paul. I went along with it and made me believe what she wanted, but my heart was with another. Melinda was actually a very nice person and she didn't deserve what she was getting. We talked for a while and I was very happy speaking to her. She was a breath of fresh air. I told her she could come visit anytime she wanted and she was very happy. I told her about how the other ladies were behaving towards me and she had said that they were just being jealous of me. Melinda left after some time and I decided to go see Israel in his office. I got and I went straight to the Israel office and I saw him with a woman who had been sitting on his lap. I couldn't see his face and I closed the door. I was about to enter the elevator when he caught up with me. I didn't know that he could do this to me, but Israel had said that the woman was forcing herself on him. I was very angry because I knew I had sacrificed a lot for him and he shouldn't cheat on me. He apologized and I followed him back to his office. By then, the supposed lady had left. Israel had told me that he was missing me, and so that he couldn't wait for everything to be over so that we could have everything that was taken from us. I spent the rest of the day with him and I left. Before getting home, I decided to stop at the grocery and get things to make food for Paul, and I ran into one of the wives. I decided to avoid her because I didn't want to make any fake conversation. As usual, she had nothing to do but to be condescending. I decided to ignore her and left. I went home and I made food for Paul before he got back. Paul likes the idea that I should be a housewife. I don't like it, but I had no choice. I had to do it just for my boyfriend, Israel. A few months into our marriage, Paul's family started to disturb him about how I was not pregnant yet, and it became an issue between me and Paul. He had told me he wanted to have children with me, and I told him I wasn't ready. I knew that it was going to be a big problem, and I spoke to Israel about it. Israel had told me that we were going to use Paul's insecurities against him, meaning that since he wanted children, I was to tell him that I could only give him children if he transferred all of his properties to me. But I thought to myself that it wasn't logical, and I didn't have such a strong hold on him yet, and he wasn't going to fall for it. I decided not to follow the plan and just give it a few years before we could strike. I didn't like it, and neither did Israel, but it was the only way. I was at home one day when Paul had called me saying that his parents had called and they wanted us to come visit them. I didn't want to because I didn't honestly like Paul's family. They were so judgmental, but I had no other choice. He picked me up and we were on our way to his parents' house. On getting there, I helped them to set the table and we began to eat. Paul's sisters are really the worst because all they added to the conversation we were having on the table was how their brother needed to have children. I didn't really pay attention to them because I was exhausted from work. But when Paul's mother started speaking about how I was a woman and it was my duty to bear children, I became very angry and I started to speak for myself. What baffled me the most was that the husband I married couldn't define me in front of his family. He was always mute. I left the dining room without finishing my food. I didn't wait for Paul. I ordered an Uber and left. I got home and it wasn't long until Paul came back and he started to tell me how wrong I was to have walked out on his parents, and I didn't care. I made him understand that it was his duty to defend me, but he was not hearing that. We had a huge argument over it and I made up my mind to just ignore him. I was so tired from that day and the whole situation. I called Israel the next day and told him it was time for us to put our next plan into action, which was for me to start acquiring Paul's properties without his knowledge. I was able to convince Paul that I wanted to work for him and that I loved his type of business. At first it wasn't easy, but he led me in, and I started to move some of his money in different bank accounts. When he noticed, he had asked me what I was doing, and I explained to him I was only moving his money around so it wouldn't attract more taxes. I didn't know that Paul was also planning a different thing at my back. I have to give it to him. He was very smart to have figured out what I was doing at that time. In my head, I thought I was moving his money, but Paul was also moving his money. It was like he knew I was an imposter right from the start. Whenever I was able to move money and some properties, I could always rejoice with my boyfriend Israel. We could celebrate. This went on for a while until it was time for us to get to the part whereby we could acquire his company and also take back Israel's company. This was our plan. I was to divorce him and I could get everything back. But everything went the opposite direction. It was like every other day, and I was at home making breakfast for Paul when he told me that he was going on a business trip and he won't be back for some weeks. I was very happy, and so I decided to go on a getaway trip with Israel. He had told me that we could only spend 3 days because he was very busy with work. I was fine with it because lately we have not been seeing much of each other. I missed him, and he missed me too. On the trip, Israel received calls and messages from an unknown number. I decided to follow it up, and I found out that it was the same girl I saw on his lap in his office. I was very disappointed. I confronted him about it, and he had explained to me that the girl didn't want to leave him alone, and I believed him. I saw a lot of signs that were supposed to have made me smart, but I ignored them. I'm regretting this till now. After our trip, I made it my plan to go and confront the said girl to leave my boyfriend alone, but I decided against it when I realized that it was just going to blow our cover. Everyone knew that I was married to Paul, but when I found out that the supposed girl was working in Israel's company, I asked Israel to sack her and he didn't. We had a huge argument over it and he told me he was tired of me suspecting him all the time. It went on for a while and I was not speaking with Israel. I went about doing my own thing, and after some days, Paul had returned from his trip. Paul had noticed that I was not really happy, and he kept asking me about what was wrong with me, but I didn't give him any good reason as to why. Israel's absence from my life then, due to the fight we had, was giving me sleepless nights. I was always thinking about the worst-case scenario. What if he was with another girl? What if he didn't love me again? These were the things that were going on in my head. I didn't want to lose Israel over a petty fight because I knew I had sacrificed a lot in the relationship. I literally just put my life on hold for him. I was not working anymore. I was living and sleeping with a man I didn't like. I literally became a housewife so that he could get back his company and also so he could get everything he had always wanted. I was literally giving up my whole freedom. I had to put up with Paul's family for him. I had to put up with everybody just because I wanted my boyfriend to have whatever he wanted, and this is how he repays me. By being nonchalant about my feelings with this said girl he was seeing. After a few days, I went over to Israel's house. I wanted to give him a piece of my mind. I met him at home and I told him that I was going to return all the money I took from Paul, and I was going to divorce Paul, and he was not going to get anything. He became so afraid and he began to beg me. I told him I was only going to listen to his pleading if he let the girl go. He kept asking me to leave her out of it, but I told him I wasn't going to. After much threatening from my side, he finally sacked the girl and I was happy. I didn't want him to be with any other person except me. A few weeks passed and Israel and I are back to normal. It was Paul's birthday week and I was putting together a party for him. With the help of Melinda, I was able to organize the whole thing. From the event hall to the catering of the event, it was beautiful. Of course, I invited the other ladies. I had no choice, by the way. Melinda had said it was me reaching out for an olive branch. But I didn't want to. Those women were toxic. How can I judge someone you just met, just because the person is not what you expect? The party was in full swing. Top businessmen and women were in attendance. I could see the happiness in Paul's face. He was very pleased. Overall, we had a good time. Paul introduced me to many of his business partners. Some of them were very gracious with their comments, and of course, the ladies spoiled the evening for me with their malicious comments. I told Paul about their behavior towards me, and of course, he had brushed it off. Israel couldn't attend because he was busy, and I knew he could have tried something if he saw how Paul was holding and taking me around the room. Somehow I was happy he was not around to see everything. Paul's parents were also in attendance. I avoided them almost throughout the night. I didn't want to talk to them because of the way they had behaved with me. His sisters were also there. Anyone could see the tension between us. They had always believed I wasn't good for their brother. I didn't care, by the way. After everyone had left the party, it was time for me to leave with Paul. I thanked Melinda and promised to come by her house the next day. She was indeed a lovely person. I couldn't have pulled everything off if it wasn't for her help. I got into the car with Paul and he thanked me for organizing everything for him. I didn't really like Paul, but I was always happy whenever he appreciated my efforts. He did have his bad sides when he just goes blank whenever I'm being insulted by his family. I began to wonder why it was so. Everything became clear to me when I found out that the reason why Paul didn't always define me in public was because he knew I wasn't genuine with him. But why did he then propose to me? All these did not make sense to me until later when I found out that he knew of my plans and relationship with Israel after we got married. I met up with Melinda the next day at her house. We chatted about everything that had happened at the party, and she told me that the ladies were jealous of how I was able to organize such a party. I had told her I was still very much confused as to why the ladies were so bitter towards me. She had said that it was just that they were surprised as to what Paul saw in me. I laughed because I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to be genuine with the ladies, but they had closed every door to that. They were not worthy of my friendship and my time. I got to meet Melinda's children. They were really beautiful. I spent some time there before I left. I met up with Israel and he told me that it was time for us to move to the next stage of our plan, the stage whereby I was going to divorce Paul. I was happy in my heart because I knew that everything was going to be over very soon. I was going to leave the marriage and be with my boyfriend, the man that I loved. Israel had told me that he was going to set Paul up with a woman and I was going to walk in on them, but I knew that was not going to work because Paul was a very careful man. I told Israel that instead of that, we were going to make it look as if it was my fault that we had to separate, and it was because I wasn't ready to give him children. I knew that children were a very sensitive topic. Paul had always wanted children, and his family had been pestering me because of it too. Israel had encouraged me to go ahead with my plans, and I was happy, because the journey we started was finally coming to an end. I spent the rest of the day with Israel before I got home. When I got home, I saw that Paul was around, and I had a discussion with him about how I was not ready to have children yet. He flipped and started to accuse me of how we had been trying for a child for some years now, and how I was using contraceptives. Indeed, I was using contraceptives. I didn't know how he found out. Paul was yelling at me about how I was a selfish person and so on. I told him that it was my body and I was not ready to have children. When Paul was not seeing things from my own perspective, I told him I was tired and I needed to rest. I walked out on him and I went to bed. The next day, I didn't see Paul throughout the day. Unknown to me that Paul was planning something on the side. When he got home the next day, I asked him where he had been. He told me since I wasn't ready to give him a child, he was going to find someone who could. I became so furious. I told him if he had done that, we were getting a divorce. I saw the shock on his face and I was happy my plan was working. Paul didn't reply to me and he walked out that day and I didn't see him for weeks. Unknown to me that Paul had already told everyone that we knew we were getting a divorce because I didn't want to have children with him. I started to receive calls from his family members about how I am a gold digger. I also continued to give them a befitting reply, how the matter was between me and Paul, and it had nothing to do with them, but they kept coming at me. The ladies were not even helping matters at all. Some of them kept calling me names, and when I had enough, I met up with them and things had escalated. With the intervention of Melinda, I was able to calm down, and she had dragged me from their midst. I wasn't going to take their insults anymore. Melinda had told me that I shouldn't just divorce Paul just like that, and that I should think about it well. I knew she was my friend, but I didn't want to let her in on my plans. It was too risky for her to know about it. I wasn't really happy that I was lying to her. I got back home and I told Israel on the phone about what I had been going through. He told me that I should endure it for the meantime, and it was going to be over very soon. His words comforted me, and it was like he had given me enough strength. At that time, Paul and I weren't really speaking anymore. We were always seeing each other at home, but we were on opposite sides. I called my lawyer because I was already tired of seeing Paul. I told my lawyers to draw up the divorce papers, and it was sent to me within 2 weeks. In the papers, it was stated that I was to get half of his properties, including Israel's company. I waited patiently for him to get home the next day, and I gave him the divorce papers. He looked at them and he started to laugh. I didn't know why he was laughing, and he told me I could hear from his lawyers very soon. He parked a few of his things and he left the house. The next day, I met up with Israel and told him that our plan was already working out. We were celebrating when I received a call from my lawyer telling me that I should meet up with him soon. He told me that he had some things he wanted to discuss with me regarding my divorce. I immediately went to see him, and I saw that it was a meeting between my lawyers and Paul's own. It was in the meeting I got to know that Paul was proving difficult. He was going to leave me with nothing. I told my lawyers that I was entitled to half of his wealth because we had been married for a while now, and I had quit my job because of him. I had no extra savings or any other property that was going to support me if we were to separate. But Paul had told me that he knew about my plans all along and how I had been moving his money without his knowledge. He told me that he knew everything, and I was very surprised. How was that even possible? I was very careful not to be caught. Paul told me that the money I had moved from his account was later transferred back to his own account without my knowledge, and that I had nothing. I began to sweat. I was already feeling very suffocated. At that point, I checked my phone and I saw that my account had been wiped clean. But I didn't care because I knew I was still going to get half of his wealth. Ignored him, and I turned to my lawyer. I told him that I wanted half of his wealth in Israel Company. But before my lawyer could reply to me, Paul had told me that it wasn't going to be possible because he knew that I and my boyfriend had been planning against him, so he had made me sign a prenup. I started laughing at him because I knew that I didn't sign any prenup. But when the prenup was handed to my lawyer, I collected it and went through it. It was clearly stated that I was not going to get anything from the marriage in case of divorce. I became chartered because right there I knew I had lost everything. I began to cry heavily. I told my lawyers that I didn't sign it, but my signature was boldly there. How or when I signed the documents, I didn't know. I had just lost everything and I didn't know what to do. Paul began to threaten me, saying that I haven't heard the last from him yet. I became very much afraid. When Paul left, I asked my lawyers if there was any place where we could find some loopholes in the prenup, but there wasn't. How was I going to explain to Israel that we had just lost everything due to my foolishness? I got home and Paul was already waiting for me at the house. He told me that he thought that I was going to change along the line, and that's why he went ahead with the marriage. When he knew about my real intentions, I started to beg him to forgive me, but he refused and said he had signed the divorce papers and everything was over. Paul threatened me, saying he wasn't done with me in Israel yet, and he went back upstairs and came down with my bags. I continued to beg him at least for him to leave me the house because I didn't know where else to go, and he told me I should go to my boyfriend's house. Paul threw me out of the house and I went straight to Israel's place. I got there and I explained everything to Israel. He started to insult me, calling me all manner of names, how I was very incompetent, and how I had made him lose everything. Before we could finish talking, the police came and arrested Israel on the charges of fraud. I was crying so much because everything came crashing down at once. I followed them to the police station and I discovered that Paul had somehow found out that Israel was laundering money through the company, and he had been gathering information ever since Paul took over the company. I tried everything I could to get Israel out that night, but the charges were too much. After a few hours, I went back to Israel's house. On getting there, I saw people bringing out things from the house saying that the house had been sealed. I lost everything that day. I didn't have a place to stay anymore. I took my bags and some of Israel's clothes and left. I was able to find a motel that day. I went to bed crying that day because of Paul's cruel revenge. The next day, I decided that I was going to see Paul in order for me to beg him so that Israel can be released. But he said he wasn't going to do such a thing and I should be happy that he didn't put me in prison as well. I cried and begged Paul, but he refused. I went back to my motel making plans to go see Israel. But when I was about to pay for my motel bills, my card started to decline the payment. And when I checked my balance, I saw that my accounts had been frozen. I had nothing left. Paul had blocked my card. Update. Hello, guys. So I did have to sign the divorce papers after so much trouble from Paul and his lawyers. I'm practically begging on the streets now, and I live in shabby places now. I wish I did better. I wish I didn't use Paul like that. As for Israel, he had refused to see me, and he is blaming me for everything that happened. And I don't understand why, because everything was his own idea. I guess the people that are bound to hurt us most are the ones that are actually close to us.